Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're very glad you're here. My name is Matt Gagel. I am the Director of Programs at Montgomery History, and thanks for joining us. I think you're going to find this presentation very enlightening. I had the chance to see a preview of it a couple weeks ago, and it was phenomenal, well-researched, and very informative. Okay, before we get started, a few things to go over. Again, thanks for joining us. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A button. Those will come to me. We'll be doing Q&A at the end of the presentation. If it's a technical question, I will do my best to answer those and help you out. I do also want to say thank you to everyone who has made a contribution to Montgomery History. We are extremely grateful for your support. We could not offer free programs like this without that support. And if you would like to make a contribution, you can visit our website at montgomeryhistory.org and click on the Donate Now button, and that will guide you through the process. And again, thank you to those who have done so and anyone who may be doing so. Next week, we'll be having a presentation on Thursday, so it's slightly different due to a scheduling conflict, but next Thursday, December 16th, John Lustria, who is the Director of Education at the Civil War Medical Museum in Frederick, will be presenting on the story of Civil War medicine and how many of the things that many of the medical practices today have their history in Civil War medicine. And many of you have visited the Stone Street Medical Museum, which kind of tells you the local connection of that. And John will be kind of presenting the more of the national narrative and how Civil War medicine still has resounding effects on medical practice today. So I hope you'll join us for that. You can learn a little bit more about that and register on our website at montgomeryhistory.org/mhconnected/watch. And that will, there's a video of last week's presentation and you can register for next week. Okay, that is all I have, just a short opening today. And we will be having I have a question about this program have video as well as audio. You should be seeing a presentation on your screen, and James does have a presentation that he'll be showing. If you're not seeing video, what I recommend is that you leave the presentation and come right back, and it should fix it for you. So with that, I'm going to stop my presentation here. And Jim, there you are. Good to see you.
Thanks, Matt.
Feel free to go right ahead whenever you're ready.
Thanks, and thanks for everybody for logging on. I'm going to start my presentation here, and we do this little dance with the computer. I'm going to talk about human bondage in Georgetown's early wealth. And this is going to be divided into about 3 parts. I'm going to talk about slave ships. Then I'm going to talk about more general issue of bondage in the Maryland area, Montgomery County, Georgetown. And that's going to be most of the talk. And then towards the end, I'm going to bring that up to today and show its effect today. A lot of this came from my book, From Slave Ship to Harvard, about Yara Mahmood, who came onto a slave ship in Annapolis, was a slave of the Bell family for 44 years, and then ended up in Georgetown, where he became famous and painted by Charles Wilson Peale. But more of it was research done specifically for this. And the origin of my interest was because there's a group in Georgetown that's trying to promote the Black history of Georgetown. And I think it's terribly important that they do that. And they've done wonderful work on it. But they added the one point, which is, I'm going to show you here, that slave ships came into Georgetown, that it was a slave port. And they based that on, and I'm going to counter that because I think there's a more important story than just whether or not slave ships came into Georgetown, because, and I'll get into that. But what their claim is, and what they based this on, was a transatlantic slave trade database. It's an online database. It's a comprehensive attempt to make all slave ships in the history coming to the Western Hemisphere. And it shows, when you do a search on it, it shows that these ships came into North Potomac. And the feeling was that North Potomac was Georgetown. And so I'm going to address that issue as well. But let's start with the slave ships themselves. If you do the transatlantic slave trade database, these are the slave ships, a histogram of the slave ships that came into Maryland and all over the history of time during the slave trade. And I'm sorry that these numbers at the bottom are really years and they're decimals, and that's because I couldn't get the spreadsheet to drop the decimal points. But you can see these, and also it's not exactly correct because the slave trade actually ended in 1775 when the American Revolution broke out. But the spreadsheet likes to make it this way. But you can see how the slave ships went up and down over time. And for example, in this period where you see a tapering off of slave ships into Maryland, this is during the French and Indian War when the economy was very uncertain. But a better sense is to compare the slave ships into Maryland and Virginia and Charleston, South Carolina. And you can see 117 slave ships, and this is during the entire slave trade. It came into Maryland, 445 into Virginia, and 811 into Charleston, South Carolina. So this is a dramatic illustration of the difference between the deep South, the middle South of Virginia, and Maryland. I also want to put an admonition on numbers. These are ships, 117. And I don't like numbers because each of these represents human beings. There were roughly, say, an average of 200 human beings on a ship, which means that over 20,000 human beings came into Maryland. Each one had a story. And so when we look at numbers, I don't want to overlook the fact these are human beings that are in very dire conditions. But on the other hand, it does show if there are 20,000 in Maryland, 22,000 in Maryland, 160,000 slaves were brought into Charleston. So we keep in the perspective of how sort of less the slave trade was in Maryland than in the Deep South. Well, talking about Georgetown, the contemporary view of Georgetown is sort of epitomized by a book like the Georgetown Ladies Social Club. It's a place for the rich and powerful, a very Tony place, elegant, neat place. But that's the modern view. And that was sort of perpetuated by the classic books on Georgetown, like Portrait of Old Georgetown by Grace Dunlop Ecker. It was a 1933 book, but it was so popular that I think many people have read it. In the 1951 edition, they had this little poem in the introduction and sort of epitomizes the contemporary view of Georgetown. The ghost of Georgetown when they meet in haunted house or moonlit street, congenial ghost across Rock Creek with formal bows and steps antique. Rehearse a spectral minuet where once in bright assemblies met, beruffled bells look love to bows and powdered wigs and faultless hose. It sort of makes Georgetown to be Paris on the Potomac. And that's, again, this more modern view of Georgetown. And I will say I'm going to talk about merchants. And I don't know specifically about Grace Dunlop Ecker, but the Dunlop name is a name in old Georgetown. And Dunlop, there were brothers who were merchants. One of them was a Tory. And when the American Revolution broke out, his property was seized. He left the colonies, and then it was ultimately sold. The third book, or another book on Georgetown, is Early Days of Washington, written in 1899 by Sally Somerville Mackle. She was a descendant of Brooke Bell, who owned Yarmouth that I wrote about. She was also a descendant of the Mackles, and they owned large property in Georgetown, including, you probably know, Dunbarton Oaks. So, when these books are written about Georgetown, they're written about the upper class of Georgetown. So they don't really cover very well what was really going on in the lower classes in Georgetown. So I'll start with how we get to all this is with the tobacco plant, which was being grown in Virginia and Maryland. And the way you got to get it to England, because that's where you're selling tobacco. And it was the cash crop in Maryland at the time, and we're talking the colonial period. And this little drawing shows you grow the tobacco, you cure it in a barn, you put it into a hogshead or a barrel, you stack it up, you take it down to an inspection station by the water, and then you get it to the United Kingdom. And here's another view of it, of compressing it into these hogsheads that weighed about 1,000 pounds. And some of them were indeed this large. But one of the problems with all of this, and it shows the role of these merchants. This barrel is going to be sent to England. And if you're unscrupulous planter, you could fill it up with oak leaves and just put a little layer of tobacco at the top. So you don't want to put this hogshead all the way to England, only to have it worthless. So the merchants who handled this and would ship it to England were vital in this whole business. They made sure that the tobacco that was sent to England was good, it wasn't rotten, and that the barrels were indeed full of tobacco. The ports where the trade with the United Kingdom went were on the west coast of Great Britain: Bristol, Liverpool, Whitehaven, and Glasgow, Scotland. And there were two reasons for this. First of all was it's shorter. A ship from London has to come out around here. Ships from Glasgow could go over the northern end of Ireland, and it was said that they were anywhere from 1 week to 2 weeks shorter voyage to the New World than it would be for ships from London. And that meant that ships from Glasgow, for example, could make 2 voyages to and from America in a season. And these ports are dealing with Maryland and our area. Now, when they got to when they got into the Maryland area, these were the ports where merchants were: Nottingham on the Patuxent River, and this is a 1895 or 1795 map. Nottingham on the Patuxent, Port Tobacco on this neck of the Potomac, Nanjemoy down here, Dumfries, Colchester, Alexandria, Bladensburg, and Georgetown. So the merchants on the west coast of the United Kingdom had men they would call factors or agents who would handle their business in these ports. They would take the tobacco that was grown here, send it to the United Kingdom. In exchange, the ships would come back with finished goods that these merchants would then sell in their stores. If we go back to the transatlantic slave trade database and the claim that North Potomac was Georgetown, you can see this is the list of ships that went to North Potomac. But off the bat, one huge problem is Georgetown didn't exist until 1751, but there wasn't even a port there until the 1740s. So these 4 ships could not have gone to Georgetown because there was nothing there. There was no place, there was no port. But this one, the True Blue, for example, in 1759, I found in the Maryland Gazette, here's the announcement for the True Blue. It didn't go to Georgetown, it went into Nanjemoy. And so if you look here, here's Nanjemoy, and there Georgetown's up here. And indeed, the transatlantic slave trade database by the phrase North Potomac meant anything that went up the Potomac. So all of these ports were ports that ships from destined for North Potomac might have gone to. But we know, for example, that with the True Blue, it did not reach Georgetown. Specifically in the Washington area, the first port here in our area was on the Anacostia. It was called Belltown, and it was up here, and it was started in 1720. But the Anacostia silted up, and so they moved the port down. They created the town of Bladensburg and put the port there in 1742. And Georgetown didn't become a community until 1751. But as I said, in the 1740s, there was a port there. But the important thing for those of us in Montgomery County is that we tend to think of Georgetown as part of Montgomery County, which it was for a time. But in fact, Bladensburg was equidistant from Rockville and could just as well provide shipping services for all of Montgomery County as Georgetown could. So there wasn't anything in the colonial period very special about Georgetown. And in fact, Port of Bladensburg claims this on their website, that it handled in its deep harbor a larger ocean tonnage than any other port in the colonies, with the exception of Yorktown. So I don't know if this is true, but they're claiming that we're counting Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, that Bladensburg was handling more tonnage than any of those ports. And that's very plausible because they're exporting tobacco. And that's a very heavy product. And so in terms of tonnage, you can imagine that a tobacco port is going to send a lot of goods to the United Kingdom. Now, we turn to the merchants, and the main merchant who is handling business in our region, the Maryland area, was John Glassford out of Glasgow. Scotsman. He never came to America. He stayed in Glasgow the whole time, and he sent agents to the United States, or I don't want to mean the United States, to the colonies to handle his business here. The agent he had in our area, in Bladensburg and Georgetown, was named Robert Peter. And there are going to be two names I'm talking about today. Robert Peter, the Peter family is one, and the other family is the Lowndes family. And I'm not going to talk very favorably about them. And I don't mean to single them out as evil, although they were very dubious quality at the time, but I do know their descendants. And so I want to sort of say, you don't hold what your ancestors did against your family. But John Glassford is the Scotsman who's running the business and the largest merchant in our area. Here's his accounting ledger from the Library of Congress, and it's 1753. And I think this is in Bladensburg. I don't understand colonial accounting, but this shows you is the way it worked. There was no cash. Charles Bell, for example, would come in with his tobacco at the end of the growing season, and he'd get a credit for however much tobacco he brought in. No cash passed hands. Then when the ships came in with finished goods, the merchants would then deduct from his credit whatever he purchased from them. So this is the way these merchants, they were in effect banks as well as merchants. There were no banks at this early colonial period. The merchants were the banks. So these people were just vital to the colonial system in our region. Another merchant in Bladensburg was Christopher Lowndes, and I said he's the other family. And this sign, I took this photograph last month. It's in Bladensburg, Market Master's house. Here's the Market Master's house. It's still there. This was his store. So when a ship came from England, the goods would be brought into the store, and you'd go there and buy the goods from him. And the store is still there. I mean, there's nothing there except this stone building. Another remnant of Christopher Lowndes is his waistcoat. And as you can see, he's looked like a rather slender man. I don't have a picture of him, but I do have a picture of his wife, Elizabeth Tasker Lowndes. This was done by Charles Wilson Peel. And the name Tasker I'm going to talk about later in just a few minutes. But this is the Lowndes family in Bladensburg. And this is the house he built called Bostwick. So you can see how prosperous he was. Unlike John Glassford, Christopher Lowndes actually came to the United States. He was from Liverpool, and he came to the United States, and he ran the business out of Bladensburg. He had a brother in Liverpool who handled that end of the business, and he had another brother in St. Kitts who ultimately ended up in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'll be talking about his family later. Here's an example of the kind of merchandise they would bring in and sell, the merchants would sell. And this is a advertisement in the Maryland Gazette by Christopher Lowndes. You can see it took up a full page column. And I blew up some of the things. And what I like to point out is thread. He would sell spools of thread. And of course, any finished goods that had to be manufactured in England. But the popular, a major thing was that he was selling needles and thread. And there's not much profit margin on those. And if you imagine a 5 and 10 cent five and dime store today, there's not much profit in a spool of thread, which may cost $3. So the merchants were always looking for big ticket items, you know. And if we bring that comparison today between a spool of thread and a big ticket item, let's say it's a Mercedes E-Class sedan selling for $60,000 or $70,000. So the difference between a five and dime store selling a spool of thread and a Mercedes dealership selling something for $60,000 or $70,000, that's a big ticket item. So the merchants in the colonies were looking for these big tickets. What kind of things could they sell that were big ticket items? And the things they could sell that were big ticket items were human beings. There were four sources of human beings. The first source were political prisoners. These were mainly Scotsmen who were fighting wars against the crown in England, and they were taken as prisoners of war and sent to America. Second source of human beings were convicts. There were more than 300 crimes in England punishable by death. You know, everything was sort of punishable by death. But if you were a first offender, you could claim the benefit of the clergy. And I won't go into the full history of that, but essentially, by the colonial period, anyone could claim the benefit of the clergy by applying to the court if they were a first offender. And to do it, you had to show that you could read, because the clergy were literate. And so if you, even if you weren't clergy, if you could read, you got the benefit of the clergy. And what they had them read was the 51st Psalm. And I suggest you look at that. It's very appropriate. It's rather long, but it's sort of relates to sin and forgiveness of sin. But of course, you didn't necessarily have to be able to read if you could memorize it. So anyone who either could read or could memorize the 51st Psalm had a pretty good chance of getting the benefit of the clergy, and it was sure better than being hanged. The third element of human beings that were brought into bondage were indentured servants. And these were poor people in England and Scotland and Ireland who sort of sold their life away in order to get tickets to America, where they would have to work for a period of years for someone else in bondage. And the fourth were slaves from Africa. And they were slaves for life. They never were free, and their children were slaves, and their children were slaves. So, and of course, the treatment was much worse, and there was all the racism involved with slaves from Africa. So we start with these four, and the first of these four were these political prisoners. Here's the Battle of Sheriff Muir in 1715, where the Scots trying to back the Stuarts and regain the crown of England, and the English army would put them down. The ones who were ringleaders were hanged and drawn and quartered. The lucky ones were sent to America as prisoners for a period of years. And here's the proclamation for these folks when they came into Annapolis. They were going to be sold to the assignees of the merchants. So the merchants, Christopher Lowndes, John Glassford, the merchants are the ones who are handling the sale of these political prisoners. And you notice the buyers, this is actually two pieces of paper that I pasted together. The buyers here are William Bladen, that's Bladensburg, and Benjamin Tasker. Remember I said that Christopher Lowndes' wife was Elizabeth Tasker Lowndes. She was Benjamin Tasker's daughter, and he ultimately became acting governor of Maryland. And we go to Christopher Lowndes himself, who is the merchant. And here we see his ad for people from about 100 servants from Glasgow arriving in Bladensburg. And this is around 1750. And you notice here's a pretty interesting thing. They're only under indenture. They're only in bondage for 4 years, the men and women. However, their children will serve until they are 21 years old. So if you're a 1-year-old infant, you're going to be in bondage for 20 years. If you're 11, which is probably 9 or 11, which would probably be the time they'd be put into service, they were in bondage for 10 to 11 to 12 years. So the parents are basically getting to America on the backs of their children. But this is a hot, big ticket item to sell these indentured servants. But Christopher Lowndes also dealt in slaves from Africa. And this is the ad for the slave ship that brought Yarmamut into Annapolis. You see Christopher Lowndes here and Benjamin Tasker Jr. That's the governor's son. He's the brother of Christopher Lowndes' wife. So these two men are brothers-in-law, and they're selling slaves. And that's really a big ticket item, especially. And so these merchants would do whatever, would pay them the most money. But the Lowndes family were really big-time slave traders. If you go to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, ships with a Lowndes as an owner, there were 42 ships with an estimated 11,000 slaves that left Africa, and 41 ships with 9,000 slaves that arrived in the New World. And the estimated percentage of slaves who died during the voyage was 5%. The difference on these numbers of ships is one of the ships went down off Hatteras. And at the moment, I'm working with the people to find out what happened to that ship. The story that I've got so far is that the slaves were taken off the ship and they did not go down with the ship. But this is the business of the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. There was, however, one ship. Oh, I'm sorry. Sort of to sum this up, Gene Russo at the Maryland State Archives did this study of who arrived in Annapolis between 1756 and 1775. And she studied 17,000 people who came into Annapolis in that period. Of those, 43.2% were indentured servants, 38.4% were convicts, 10.9% were slaves, and only 7.5% were free people. So that 92.5% of the people who came into Annapolis in this time period were in bondage. This Maryland was not founded by pilgrims. Now, there was one ship that I did discover that was going to bring slaves from Africa into Georgetown. And this was the Peggy in 1770 by the merchants Barnes and Ridgate out of Virginia. And it said, this oddly, that half of them would be sold in Georgetown and half in Nottingham on the same day. And so when you look at this map, Nottingham's here, Georgetown's here. A sailing ship can't be in both places on the same day. And so the ad doesn't explain how this happened. It was taken out at Port Tobacco, so presumably the slave ship had come up, stopped at Port Tobacco, and then somehow or other was going to get its slaves half to Georgetown and half to Nottingham the next week. Whether they went by water or by land, who knows? But this is the only record I found that slaves from Africa were destined for Georgetown. Otherwise, there's no record that a slave ship ever was going to take things to Georgetown, because Georgetown's the end of the line. It's the end of the tobacco economy. Those falls at Georgetown prevent ships from going any farther. And so it's the end of the line. Now move on to Robert Peter, who was the factor for John Glassford and Company. And then he went out on his own and he became the leading merchant in Georgetown. But to talk about him, I have to start at the Boston Tea Party. In December of 1773, England put a tax on tea, and so the good citizens of Boston boarded the ships and threw the chest of tea into the water. That's December of 1773. In August of 1774, it was discovered that the Committee on Correspondence, the Revolutionary Committee for Frederick County, including Georgetown, learned that there were 11 chests of tea destined for Virginia and Maryland, and one was going to go to Robert Peter of Georgetown. And so Robert Peter, this is August of 1774, knows what happened in Boston, and he went and he says, please don't throw my tea into the Potomac. And so he made an offer to the Committee on Correspondence, and they agreed that he would deliver, either give the tea back if he could, or turn it over to these three men to hold until the committee decided what to do with it. Now it's, so, he's not, it's a pretty good deal for him, and he doesn't lose his teeth. I will say here that Thomas Johns is an interesting fellow. All of these upper class people were related. He was the agent for Barnes and Ridgate, the people who were going to bring slaves into Georgetown. So he was their agent in Georgetown. He was the brother or brother-in-law of Brooke Bell, who owned Yarrow Mammoth. So he's in that element. And you may have heard of the Johns family of Maryland, major family in Maryland, including Johns Hopkins University. So this shows you how these slave businesses were very complicated. Robert Peter took out an ad for a slave from Africa who had run away from him in Georgetown. But he says in this ad in 1761 that he bought the slave from someone else. So that doesn't show that Robert Peter, who was based in Georgetown, didn't buy the slave from someone from a port of Georgetown. He bought it from someone else. But these runaways are very common. You look at any newspaper from the time, they were weekly newspapers, and there'd be maybe 4 or 5 ads for runaways, runaway slaves, runaway indentured servants, runaway convicts. You didn't really want to be in bondage. And so, this 17,000 people come into Maryland, many of 92% are in bondage. They would run away if they could. And so we see this running away. But the indentured servants ran away too. Here's an ad for the Hagerstown newspaper where a runaway fellow from Pennsylvania named James Johnston. And I think this is a relative of mine because my family part of the Johnstons came from that part of Pennsylvania. But you see, he's 17 years old. He's got 4 more years to go on his indenture. And so he's tired of it. He runs away. Maybe it was his parents. Maybe he came over with his parents and he was been indentured for his whole life, and he fed up with it and he runs away. So people were running away all the time. And that shows you what bondage was like, both for slaves and for these other groups of people in bondage. Now let's turn specifically to Georgetown. Sort of the toniest place in Tony, Georgetown today is Tudor Place. And it was along Georgetown Heights. The first person to buy, these were laid out in 8.5 acre tracts. And originally the whole top of Georgetown had these big tracts of land. Tudor Place is the best example of the surviving property. It's now only 5.5 acres, but it originally was 8.5 acres. And the first owner of that was Francis Lowndes. And here we see his ad in 1805 or 1806 to sell it. It was sold in 1806. He is the son of Christopher Lowndes, the slave trader, the merchant in Bladensburg. So Francis Lowndes has gotten his money, inherited his money from his father, the slave trader, the indentured servant trader, the merchant. And he's going to sell this property, and it's not quite complete. He's got a stable on one side, a stable and carriage house on one side, and a house on the other. And he's going to sell this to Thomas Peter. Thomas Peter is the son of Robert Peter, the merchant in Georgetown. So Thomas Peter is a lucky man. He's inherited a lot of money from his dad, and he has married Martha Park Custis. She is the granddaughter of Martha Custis Washington. And so he is married to the stepdaughter of George Washington, step-granddaughter of George Washington. So he buys the house from the other merchant's son, Francis Lowndes, for $6,000. And here is the house today, taken from the street. But this part, the main part of the house, isn't there. He's paid $6,000 for this wing and the property, and he contracts with William Thornton, the architect of the Capitol, to build this magnificent place and make Tudor Place the fancy home it is today. Well, where does Thomas Peter get his money? He gets his money from selling slaves from his father. And here's an ad in the Maryland Gazette in 1809 or 18, yeah, no, this is 1806, just the same year he's bought the house. Robert Peter has an estate at Sugarlands in Montgomery County, a mile from Seneca Mill, and there are about 50 valuable slaves there he's going to sell. And then that's Montevideo out in Montgomery County in the Sugarland area. And a second ad by Thomas Peter for 150 Negroes. Again, this is January 1808. So he's got 200, at least 200 slaves here that he inherited from his father, and he's selling them. He takes out another ad in 1806 saying that he's going to sell a property at Monocacy that belonged to General Washington. This is his wife's step-grandfather, 519 acres. And that's, here's the mouth of Monocacy. But another ad for the same property, same 519 acres, adds he will also sell a number of likely Negro boys and girls. So Thomas Peter has sold over 200 slaves that he inherited either from his father or from George Washington's side of, from George Washington. The going rate for a male slave at that time was $500. A female slave, a younger female woman, would be maybe $400. Of course, older people and children would be less. But Thomas Peter is going to make, say, anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 by selling slaves. And so what does he do with that money? He puts it into Tudor Place. And so the Tudor Place, not only has he bought it from the son of a slave trader, but he himself makes money from selling his slaves of his father and his wife's step-grandfather. I'm going to digress, just quickly add some humor. In addition to the other things he inherited from George Washington is the mule. George Washington was the father of the country and the father of the American mule, also called the Missouri mule. I come originally from Missouri, and we claim for some reason proudly that we have Missouri mules. If you don't know, a mule can't reproduce. It is the product of a male donkey and a female horse. George Washington thought that the mule would be the work animal of this country. And so he wanted to encourage the breeding of horses and donkeys to make mules. And he passionately wanted a donkey from Spain because they were considered the best studs. And Spanish donkeys are called asses. The male Spanish donkey is a jack. And so jackass is a male donkey from Spain. And when George is president, the king of Spain, Spain will not allow the jackasses to be exported, but the king of Spain gives George Washington a breeding set. And so George Washington owns this jackass that can breed the mules he wants. And so we see Thomas Peter taking an ad out in the newspaper for stud services for Pizarro, a fine young jack that he has inherited from George Washington. Now, I'm going to put the Peter family aside and go back to the Lowndes. The Lowndes have sold their house to the Peter. Francis has sold the house to the Peter family. And he then opens a warehouse on the Potomac, and it's called Lowndes Wharf. And you can see in this ad, he is arranging for a ship to go from Georgetown to Charleston, South Carolina. Christopher Lowndes' brother was in St. Kitts and then settled in Charleston, and there are Lowndes in Charleston. So Francis Lowndes has cousins in Charleston, and they own Lowndes Grove in Charleston, one of the big fancy houses in Charleston. And he's in communication with his cousins. And one of them, the man who owns that house, is Congressman William Lowndes of South Carolina, who was somewhat famous in his day, not in current days, but he was a big defender of states' rights, a big defender of the South, a big defender of slavery. And he made his reputation in the South as a defender of the Southern way of life, including slavery. As a result of that, 3 states, Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama, named counties after him. There's a Lowndes County, Mississippi, a Lowndes County, Georgia, and a Lowndes County, Alabama. As a congressman, he lived in Georgetown, so undoubtedly he got socialized with his cousin Francis in Georgetown. So he was, this is from what Charles Willson Peale said about William Lowndes, and I think it may tell everything we need to know about him. He was a tall, slim man with a long nose and large mouth. That it's probable that his aversion to have a picture of himself painted is that he might be thinking himself too homely, and he refused to have a picture painted by Charles Willson Peale. But Peale, in his diary, adds this little commentary editorial: the temper of a man in a powerful degree fashions, as I may say, the turns of the features. That Lowndes wasn't was too homely, not because of his features, but because of his character with his views on slavery. Now, that shows us the merchants and the relationship between the Peter family and the Lowndes family in Georgetown, and how they owned this big fancy house in Georgetown and a big fancy house in South Carolina. I'm going to move up through history now. In 1855, this is a map of Georgetown in 1855 that shows where African Americans lived. Each red dot is an African American residence. So you can see that in the less desirable places, along Rock Creek, where it's stinky and smelly and lots of insects, along the river and the canal, and then up along High Street or Wisconsin Avenue, which is a commercial street and probably not a very desirable place to live. But old Georgetown, the old Georgetown of Grace Dunlop Ecker, is still lily white in that time. And the same is over in this section on the west side of Wisconsin. This is what Georgetown looked like in 1861 from the Virginia. And you can see it's sort of a messy port and not a very desirable place. And also not many trees. And then after the Civil War, I did the same thing with African Americans. And you can see a great increase in the Black population of Georgetown, again in the less desirable areas. And again, old Georgetown is still largely lily white, as is this section west of Wisconsin Avenue. And here's what Georgetown looked like in 1890 at Dunbarton and Wisconsin. This is looking south towards the river. You know, it doesn't look as Tony as you think of it would look. And so when we come up to modern times, what happened to all this? Well, this is best characterized. I found this review of a play by Bruce Norris in the Georgetown Metropolitan in 2010, where he has this pretty right. By the early 20th century, almost half the population in Georgetown was African American. But once the New Deal came in, and with all these new people, wealthy people from Roosevelt's administration coming in, they realized there was the charm of Georgetown and the architectural character. And so they started buying up homes, and the number of African Americans living in Georgetown started declining. And then came the old Georgetown Act in 1950. And some argue, as I do, that it was the death knell of Georgetown's Black population. They put in architectural controls. And as Bruce Norris says, it's very difficult for a neighborhood to be historically protected, yet remain a working class neighborhood. It is so expensive to keep up your house or to improve your house where you have architectural controls that it drove poor people out of Georgetown. And in 1950, this act was passed. And I looked at the hearings in Congress that were held, one day of hearings. Everybody favored this. They wanted to, beautify Georgetown. Only one man opposed it, and that was the Reverend Foy of Mount Zion Methodist Church in Georgetown, the Black church then. And the congressman asked him, have you noticed, are you claiming that this is going to drive blacks out of Georgetown? Has anything like that happened in Alexandria, Richmond, or Charleston? Reverend Foy, there in Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans, you have a community ethos or atmosphere which is totally in accord with anything which may be in the form of a restricted covenant or prohibitions, anything to drive blacks out of the community. In those cities, the very air which is breathed would naturally support any movement with total disregard to any minority group. And that indeed is what has happened to Georgetown, together with in 1966, the Peter descendant at Tudor Place put a scenic easement over the property to keep it looking the way it did when his ancestor bought it. And so today, if you look at an aerial photograph of Georgetown, or if you walk the streets, it's gorgeous, expensive place. There's Tudor Place at the center. And it is a product of the old Georgetown Act and very other attempts to return Georgetown to a glory that it never really had. Now, before I end, remember, I want to go to back to the Lowndeses and William Lowndes, who had the counties named after him. One of those counties was Lowndes County, Alabama. And this is a headline from the New York Times, headlines from the New York Times in 1965. Dr. Martin Luther King led a march from Montgomery to Selma, Alabama. It went through Lowndes County. Almost the entire march was through Lowndes County. And one of the civil rights workers was shot to death. Another one was shot to death as well. It had voting tests that prevented blacks from voting. They formed private schools for whites so they wouldn't have to integrate the schools. The Negroes were not on juries. In those days, Lowndes County, Alabama was called Bloody Lowndes because what was done to the civil rights worker and the treatment of African Americans in Lowndes County. And this is the Lowndes, part of the Lowndes family that owned Tudor Place in Georgetown. And it wasn't until Martin Luther King made it to Selma that victory was achieved, but it was through Bloody Lowndes. And so as I wrap up, when you look at Tudor Place today, this house and this house were built by Francis Lowndes, the son of a slave trader. And this house was built by Thomas Peter, who gained anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 from selling slaves. So that is the history of Georgetown and the early wealth.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim. We do have some questions that have come in, so we'll jump right into that. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button. Those will come to me. We'll get to as many of those as we can. May not be able to get to all of them. Someone asks, where exactly is Bladensburg Port? I don't know. I didn't know there was a body of water there.
Anacostia River, just across the bridge, about 5 miles from the capital. Bladensburg, Maryland is right, part of, right across the district line.
Okay. Next question here. It says, and to clarify, the ad said that married and indentured servants were sold together, whereas enslaved African families were not. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, that's, I think, a good assumption. You could sell, I mean, generally, children were not brought on slave ships. Generally, slave ships were males, work, men who could work in the fields, and to some extent, younger women. So they wouldn't bring families onto slave ships. Although Yarmamut came with a sister. So.
Okay. Someone asks, how could Thomas Peter sell any of George Washington's slaves if Washington freed all of them in his will upon Martha's death?
I told her, I knew I'd get that question. I don't have an answer to that. I think that obviously he did sell slaves for George Washington's estate. I think you probably ought to address that to Mount Vernon. It may be that these were in Maryland and not in Virginia. That may have made a difference, or it may have been that these were. It may be that Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of any scenario other than the fact that the belief that George Washington freed all his slaves is not correct.
Okay. Someone says, hello from the Marietta House Museum. A couple of questions. Can you show the ad again that talks about shipping to Georgetown and Nottingham? So I don't know if you can pull that up quickly or not.
That would,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Julia, if you want to get in touch with me, I can get you in touch with Jim here, and we can see if we can get that sorted out for you.
Yes.
She then says, what is the date of the port at Nottingham, given the date that you shared for the port at Bladensburg was 1742?
The port at Nottingham was in the 1740s, I think. I don't have a date for when Nottingham was a port. I know it was a John Glassford port, probably 1750s.
Okay.
Let me add a little bit more. The tobacco economy started in St. Mary's County, Maryland, and moved north and west over about 100 years. And so the farther northwest you were, the later you were. Georgetown was sort of the last of the ports. So in 1751, so that section of Maryland would have been raising tobacco earlier than Georgetown was founded.
Okay. I have a couple people who have mentioned that they have read or have heard that the slaves were Martha Washington's slaves, not George Washington's slaves. So there may have been some.
I understand, but that property in Montgomery County was owned by George Washington. So I think let me sort of fill in what I do know. George Washington supposedly freed his slaves on his death in 1799 or whenever it was. Martha's were not freed, and most of the slaves that were working at Mount Vernon were Martha's. So her slaves were not free. But there were all these things that I think some of the slaves were supposed to be freed at Martha's death, and she then started fearing that they would kill her in order to get free. And so it's a really interesting story, but I can't explain the Montgomery County aspects.
Okay. Let's see here. What do we have? Steve asks, is there any evidence that there were professional firms specializing in the purchase and sale of enslaved Africans that maintained offices in Georgetown?
No.
Okay.
No, there's no record at all. There were so few ships that were coming to Maryland. As I showed, 117 ships over almost a 100-year period. 100-year period. Maybe one or two ships a year coming into Maryland. So, this was not a business that you wanted to be in, that you could be in full time. The people that doing it were merchants because they had other, this was a sidelight to their business.
Okay. Someone asks, how did Georgetown's economy change and or stay the same between 1800 and 1860?
Oh, well, it once the capital was moved to Washington, the District of Columbia, then everything changed for Georgetown. Whether Georgetown would have survived without the capital being here, who knows? But you just can't. It probably would have not have been a major city, although once the C&O Canal was built. But again, the C&O Canal was built after the capital was moved. So I think Georgetown is always, its history is completely dependent on the fact it was right next to the capital.
Okay. William asks, was the M Street Market a slave market?
No, and that's a good question. And the reason I say no is when I look through the newspapers, and I've done a lot of research into old newspapers, look through the newspapers, there were no slave markets. The way slaves were sold was through estate sales. Generally you'd either, if you wanted to get rid of a slave, you'd sell him privately, or when you died, then they'd have an estate sale, and the slaves would be sold usually at the house. When you look at the newspapers, it'd say, estate sale, all the property of so and so and 3 slaves. And if there were a slave sale, Georgetown didn't have a courthouse. I think that the only time I ever saw slaves being sold were not at the market, but at the tavern, because that's where usually you would have slave sales.
Okay, I have a couple questions about the Lowndes descendants. Can you talk a little bit about later generations of the Lowndes and their relationship with enslaved people? Did they free their slaves? Where are they now? Some of the connections there,
Okay.
generally.
Well, the significant thing is Christopher Lowndes, one of his descendants, became governor of Maryland. So, it was a very influential Maryland family. I can't talk about the ones who have been contacted me, I think for the privacy reasons. They did tell me that they're mainly descended from people that the Lowndes family married into or married with, and they said those people owned slaves. And in fact, until, the Civil War, they were owning slaves. So I think the Lowndes family in Maryland continued to own slaves. Of course, the slave trade ended in 1807 by Constitution and Act of Congress.
Let's see here. Do you have any suggestions for researching this topic?
Suggestions for researching this topic? Well, I mean, I think that it's tough, but I mean, the newspapers are the best source. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database did all the research that you don't want to replicate that research, because it's, they went to Lloyd's of London, they went to the shipping records in England, they went to all sorts of records. So it's a very comprehensive database. And I've not seen any good records outside of that other than the newspapers. And I also want to say that I think we're running out of time. And when we do, people that want to email me directly, my email address is james.h.johnston@gmail.com. Feel free to email me with questions if we run out of time.
Well, yeah, I was going to wrap up here, but there was a question that I wanted to get to. Now I can't find it. Give me just a moment here. Okay. So Carlton asks, what did the word quote, likely, frequently seen on ads mean in regard to selling slaves?
It just meant these were good, likely always meant friendly, personable. You didn't want to have, I saw the same thing with regard to convicts and indentured servant runaway. They'd say he's a likely fellow, meaning, he's going to be a pretty, you wouldn't think he's going to be a bad guy.
Okay, well, we are going to go ahead and wrap things up because it is 3 o'clock. Again, I apologize that we didn't get to all the questions. Tried to get to those that were relevant to this talk, and kind of a lot of people had asked. So again, I apologize. And you can always reach out to Jim, james.h.johnston@gmail.com. And you can also contact me, and I'll forward those on to him. My email is mgagle, it's MGAGLE @montgomeryhistory.org. Jim, any closing thoughts as we wrap up here?
No, I do want, I guess I want to praise the group in Georgetown. It's Georgetown Tour and Landmark Project, and they're doing the really wonderful work there. And again, if you look at Georgetown today, it is not the Georgetown that existed historically. Historically, it was a third Black. In around the turn of the 20th century, it was half African American. So I think it is important to remember that Georgetown was indeed a very integrated community. Okay, well, again, Jim, thank you so much. Everyone, thanks for joining us today, and I hope we'll see you next Thursday at 2 o'clock. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or Jim. Thanks, Jim. We'll see you soon. Thank you. Have a good one. Bye. Bye.